Have you ever met someone who is physically grown, professionally successful, socially respected, but emotionally, they're still a child wearing an adult's body? You say something small, and suddenly they explode. You ask for clarity, and they shut down. You try to communicate, and it turns into a tornado of drama. And you're left wondering, is this person just emotionally immature? Let me save you the confusion. It's not you. You're just dealing with someone who never learned the emotional skills their age promised. Today, I'm going to break down the top 3 signs of emotional immaturity, the signs that tell you, without question, that you're not talking to an adult, you're talking to a grown child. Emotionally immature people treat responsibility like it's a hot coal. They drop it as fast as they can. You point out something they did, they deny it. You express a feeling, they flip it back on you. You confront the behavior, suddenly you are the problem. They rewrite the story so they never have to be the villain, even for a moment. But here's the truth. Emotionally mature adults don't fear accountability. They use it. They grow from it. Immature people avoid accountability because accountability requires self-awareness, and self-awareness requires honesty. And honesty threatens their ego. So instead of, "I'm sorry, I didn't handle that well," you hear, "You're too sensitive. You misunderstood. Why are you attacking me? It wasn't that serious." Their priority isn't understanding. Their priority is protecting their pride. And the worst part, when you try to explain your experience, they turn the conversation into a maze. They redirect, deflect, and manipulate until you're apologizing for the very thing they did wrong. That's emotional immaturity. They can't regulate their emotions. They react, explode, or shut down. And when you're dealing with someone like that, you start to feel like you're walking through a minefield built by someone who never learned how to handle what they feel. Emotional immaturity shows up strongest in the moments where life requires calm, clarity, or communication. But instead of responding like an adult, they respond like a system that's overloaded. One small disagreement becomes a storm. One correction becomes betrayal. One boundary becomes an attack. Not because the situation was big, but because their emotional capacity is small. When someone can't regulate their emotions, their reactions are almost never about you. They're about whatever they've never learned to handle inside themselves. You say something simple like, "Hey, I didn't like how that felt," and suddenly they're offended, defensive, or destroyed. Their emotional response is out of proportion because they don't have the internal tools to match reality. What they feel becomes bigger than what happened. Their nervous system hits the panic button, and everything in them goes into survival mode: fight, flight, or freeze. And whoever is closest pays the price. For some people, that reaction looks like exploding. They raise their voice, talk over you, twist your words, or unleash anger that doesn't fit the moment. When someone explodes easily, it's usually because anger is the only emotional language they ever learned. It's not strength, it's not dominance. It's the emotional equivalent of a toddler throwing a tantrum in an adult body. And the sad part is they truly believe their reaction is justified because they feel it so strongly. They think intensity equals truth, but intensity often equals unhealed. For others, the reaction is shutting down. They go silent, they withdraw, they offer short, clipped responses. They walk away mid-conversation. They act like your attempt to communicate is too overwhelming, too heavy, too much. But what they're really saying is, "I don't know how to stay present when I feel uncomfortable." Their shutdown is a protective reflex, a way to avoid the vulnerability that conversation requires. It's easier to disconnect than to deal. Easier to go numb than to admit their feelings. Easier to retreat than to risk being wrong or seen. And then there are the ones who don't explode and don't go silent. They emotionally spiral. They exaggerate the moment. They catastrophize. They turn a small issue into a crisis. They panic, overthink, collapse into self-pity, or start projecting worst-case scenarios. Their emotional world has no anchor, so everything feels like a threat. Instead of problem-solving, they melt down into a story that reinforces how helpless or misunderstood they feel. They're not trying to manipulate. They're trying to survive emotions that feel bigger than them. The problem is emotional dysregulation doesn't stay contained. It spills into your life. It interrupts the conversation you were trying to have. It forces you to manage their reaction instead of addressing the issue. Suddenly you're calming them down, reassuring them, walking on eggshells, or holding the emotional weight of the entire interaction. Meanwhile, the actual topic gets lost. Emotional immaturity breeds communication chaos, and the person who regulates better always ends up doing the emotional labor. And if you're naturally calm, patient, or empathetic, their dysregulation can trick you into believing you're the one who needs to adjust. You start saying less, asking for less, expressing less, not because you don't have needs, But because you fear triggering a reaction, you shrink your voice to protect their stability. But here's the painful truth. Regulating yourself for two people isn't emotional maturity, it's emotional survival. And it slowly teaches you that peace only exists when you abandon yourself. People who can't regulate their emotions often blame others for their reactions. They'll say you made them angry, upset, overwhelmed, or silent. But no one can make another adult react. They are responsible for their feelings, their choices, their tone, their actions. Emotional maturity is understanding that feelings are internal experiences, not weapons to be thrown at others. Emotionally immature people haven't learned that yet. They think feelings justify behavior, and that makes communication feel like walking through a maze with no exit. When someone reacts instead of responds, the relationship becomes unpredictable. You never know what version of them you're going to get. Are they fine today? Will they lash out? Will they withdraw? Will they overreact to something harmless? That unpredictability becomes emotional instability, and emotional instability becomes emotional exhaustion for the people around them. You don't realize how heavy it is until you finally experience someone who can regulate, someone who listens, pauses, breathes, and responds with clarity instead of chaos. The wildest part is that emotional regulation is a learnable skill, but immature people resist learning because it requires self-awareness. It requires admitting, my reactions are hurting people. It requires facing uncomfortable truths about yourself. Emotionally immature people run from that mirror. They'd rather protect their ego than strengthen their emotional intelligence. They'd rather guard the reaction than grow from the moment. So when someone can't regulate their emotions, everything becomes dramatic, personal, or chaotic. They don't allow room for nuance. They don't leave space for discussion. They don't create safety in conversation. Their emotions take the wheel, and everyone else is forced into the passenger seat, whether they like it or not. And until that person chooses to grow, no amount of patience or perfection on your part will change how they show up. You can't teach someone emotional regulation if they're committed to reacting. You can't have calm communication with someone who treats every emotion like an emergency. And you can't build a stable relationship with someone who loses control whenever they feel discomfort. Emotional regulation isn't optional for healthy communication. It's foundational. And the moment you recognize that, you stop taking their reactions personally and start protecting your own peace.
They struggle with honest communication. Everything becomes conflict or drama. And when you're dealing with someone like that, even the simplest conversation can feel like you're tiptoeing through a battlefield. You bring up something small, something normal, something healthy, and somehow it turns into an argument, a meltdown, or a scene. With emotionally immature people, honesty isn't a doorway to understanding. It's a trigger, it's a threat. It's a spark that ignites a reaction they were never taught to manage. So instead of listening, they defend. Instead of clarifying, they accuse. Instead of communicating, they escalate. When someone can't handle honest communication, they hear truth as an attack. You say, I felt hurt when that happened, and they respond like you just tore down their entire character. They blur the lines between accountability and criticism. Any request becomes a complaint. Any boundary becomes rejection. Any feedback becomes betrayal. You're not trying to fight, you're trying to connect, but they only know how to interpret honesty through the lens of conflict. Their emotional maturity stops where discomfort begins. They can't sit in a tough conversation without personalizing everything. If you try to talk calmly about an issue, they twist it into something bigger. They'll say, so you think I'm a terrible person, or wow, I guess nothing I do is good enough for you, or I can't believe you're attacking me like this. They shift the conversation away from the actual problem and toward their emotional reaction. Instead of addressing what you said, they react to what they felt, and what they felt is almost always magnified. 1 inch of honesty becomes a mile of drama, and because everything becomes drama, nothing gets solved. The original issue stays untouched, the conversation derails, you end up comforting them, clarifying things they already understood, or apologizing for emotions that aren't even yours. Their inability to communicate honestly forces you into emotional roles you never signed up for. The fixer, the stabilizer, the peacekeeper. You didn't want a fight, you wanted a discussion, but with emotionally immature people, discussion requires emotional regulation they don't have. Some people respond to honest communication by going on the offense. They attack before they can be held accountable. They raise their voice, talk over you, bring up old wounds, or shift blame so quickly you forget why the conversation even started. Their goal isn't understanding. Their goal is protecting their ego, and the fastest way for them to do that is through conflict. If they turn it into a fight, they don't have to face their own vulnerability. Others respond through avoidance. They shut down, escape, or pretend the issue isn't real. They give short answers, dismiss the conversation, or suddenly become too tired to talk about anything important. Avoidance is their emotional shield. Drama doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like withdrawal, silence, or disappearing until the tension fades. But that silence doesn't solve anything. It only delays the conversation, adds confusion, and creates more emotional distance. And then there are the ones who try to flip the script entirely. They make you feel guilty for bringing up something real. You say, "I need better communication," and they say, "I can't believe you think I'm that bad." You express a boundary, and they act like you're punishing them. They turn themselves into the victim the moment honesty enters the room. Their emotional immaturity doesn't allow them to see that communication is supposed to create connection, not chaos. The hardest part is how this affects you. Over time, you start hiding your feelings to keep the peace. You filter your words. You soften everything you say. You practice your sentences in your head before you speak them. You avoid topics that matter because you already know how the conversation will go. You end up carrying the emotional weight of two people, regulating your feelings and theirs. And slowly, you lose your own voice in the relationship. Emotionally immature people mistake discomfort for danger. They mistake communication for confrontation. They mistake honesty for hostility. That means any attempt to grow, heal, or improve the relationship feels like an attack to them. And because they fear vulnerability, they create drama to distract from it. Drama becomes a smokescreen. Conflict becomes their escape hatch. They would rather argue than admit their hurt. They would rather cause chaos than acknowledge their insecurity. They would rather shut down than risk being seen. The truth is, honest communication requires emotional courage. It requires owning your feelings without collapsing under them or exploding because of them. It requires listening to things you might not like without losing control. It requires the maturity to separate who you are from what someone is addressing. Emotionally immature people haven't built that separation. They are fused with their emotions, so anything that touches a feeling feels like it threatens their identity. When someone sees every honest conversation as conflict, you can't build a realistic, stable connection with them. You can't solve problems, you can't grow together, you can't create safety. Instead, you keep cycling through the same patterns. You speak, they react, you retreat. And that cycle becomes the unspoken script of the relationship. Until a person learns how to communicate without turning everything into a fight or a performance,